We are often taught that the Mongol Empire was forged solely by the sword and the savagery of the horse archer. But hidden behind that martial glory was a darkness so profound, so meticulously organized, that it chilled the blood of generals who had waded through rivers of gore without flinching. This is the terrifying reality of the Yasa, the secret legal code that transformed Genghis Khan from a mere warlord into the architect of the most efficient slavery system. Human history had ever seen a system where justice for some meant the absolute dehumanization of others. If you are ready to uncover the truth, subscribe and leave a like to aid our discovery, and whisper in the comments below, from which safe city are you watching this tonight? To understand the machinery of death that would later consume Asia, we must first cast our gaze backward to the frozen steppes of the 1170s, where a teenager named Temujin sat in absolute darkness. He was not yet the great Khan. He was merely a prisoner of the Taichiud clan, a rival faction that had hunted him down like a wild dog. But unlike a dog, he was not kept in a cage, he was bound by a kange. Imagine, if you possess the stomach for it, the sensation of rough-hewn wood gnawing at your neck, for weeks on end, a heavy yoke that denies you the simple dignity of lying down to sleep, or the ability to raise a hand to feed yourself. The primary sources specifically, the secret history of the Mongols, do not shy away from the humiliation of this moment, describing how the future ruler of the world was reduced to a helpless object. He could not wipe the sweat from his brow, nor could he swat away the flies that gathered to feast on the filth accumulating on his skin. Every night, he was dragged to a different tent to be watched by a different guard, a living trophy on display to prove that his lineage had been broken. But it was in this paralysis, within this wooden coffin for the living, that Temujin's mind began to sharpen with a terrifying clarity. While a lesser man might have been consumed by despair or the simple animal desire for revenge, Temujin was observing. He watched the guards through the haze of his suffering, noting how their discipline crumbled under the influence of fermented mare's milk, how their bonds of loyalty were fragile things easily frayed by petty grievances or momentary distractions. He realized then that the traditional structures of the steppe, where loyalty was tied to blood and clan, were fundamentally flawed because blood could be spilled and clans could turn their backs on their own kin. He knew this better than anyone, for his education in betrayal had begun long before the Kangwe. Years earlier, when he was but 9 years old, his father Yasuge had been poisoned by Tatar rivals at a feast, a violation of the sacred laws of hospitality that bound the nomadic tribes. In the aftermath of that murder, the very people who had sworn allegiance to his father looked at Temujin's mother, Holan, and her children, and saw not a family to be protected, but a burden to be discarded. The secret history records the chilling indifference of that abandonment, noting that the clan simply packed up their yurts and rode away, leaving a widow and her orphans to face the brutal Mongolian winter alone. They left them to die, not by the sword, which would have been a mercy, but by the slow, agonizing process of starvation and exposure. It is written that Holan, a woman of iron, will kept her children alive by digging for roots with a sharp stick and gathering the fallen fruits of the orchard, struggling for sustenance in a landscape that seemed to want them dead. Young Temujin learned then that the romantic ideals of tribal loyalty were nothing more than a convenient fiction used by the strong to control the weak until it was no longer profitable. He understood as he shivered in the biting wind that social bonds meant absolutely nothing when survival was at stake, and that the only currency that held any true value in this world was power. Raw, undeniable power that could force obedience where loyalty failed. These twin traumas, the abandonment in the snow and the enslavement in the Kangul, forged a psychological architecture that was entirely unique. He did not merely want to conquer his enemies, He wanted to rewrite the rules of existence so that he would never again be at the mercy of another man's whim. He envisioned a new world order, a society where advancement was not based on who your father was, but on your absolute competence and your unwavering obedience to the law. And so, when he finally united the warring tribes in 1206, standing by the banks of the Onan River to be proclaimed Genghis Khan, he did not celebrate with a chaotic feast, but with the promulgation of the Yasa. This was his great law, a code that has confused historians for centuries, because on the surface, it appears shockingly progressive for a man painted as a barbarian. Under the Yasa, the kidnapping of women was strictly forbidden, a revolutionary concept in a culture where bride theft was a common practice. Adultery was punishable by death for both men and women, creating a strange sort of equality in virtue. Religious tolerance was mandated, allowing Christians, Muslims, and Buddhists to pray without fear of persecution. And perhaps most significantly, it became illegal to enslave any Mongol. To the nomadic warrior who had spent centuries in a cycle of fratricidal violence, this must have seemed like the dawn of a golden age, a system built on justice and meritocracy. But the brilliance of Genghis Khan lay in what was left unsaid. The Yasa was indeed a shield protecting the Mongol people from the chaos of the steppe, but it was also a sword pointed at the throat of the rest of the world. The law forbade the enslavement of Mongols, yes, but in doing so, it implicitly categorized all non-Mongols as something else entirely. They were not covered by the protections of the Yasa. They were not citizens of this new order. They were in the cold calculus of the Khan resources. If you were outside the circle of the felt walls, you were not truly human in the legal sense, but rather an asset to be managed, harvested and distributed. This was the trap that his generals did not see closing until it was too late. They believed they were spreading a civilized code of law, but they were actually serving a system of industrialized dehumanization, where the very concept of rights was weaponized. The progressive elements of the Yasa, the protection of women, the religious freedom served a dual purpose. They unified the Mongols internally, creating a cohesive, unbreakable core, while justifying the total subjugation of outsiders, who by resisting this new order were seen not as brave defenders of their homes, but as rebels against a divine law. This distinction is crucial for what followed, because it explains how a man could forbid the mistreatment of his own people, while simultaneously ordering the systematic dismantling of entire civilizations. It was not hypocrisy in his mind, it was hierarchy. And as the Mongol war machine turned its gaze outward toward the great cities of the Islamic world, this legalistic framework would facilitate horrors that went far beyond simple slaughter. Let us now transport ourselves across the sands of time to the year 1220, standing before the gates of Bukhara, a city that was not merely a habitation, but a jewel in the crown of the Islamic Golden Age. If you were a merchant walking its vibrant streets in the days before the darkness arrived, you would have been surrounded by the intoxicating scent of spices from the Silk Road, the rhythmic clanging of master metalworkers fashioning steel of legendary quality, and the hushed murmurs of scholars debating theology in libraries that rivaled any in the known world. Imagine for a moment that you are one of those citizens. You look up at the towering walls that encircle your home, and you feel a sense of invincibility, because these fortifications have withstood sieges before, and the garrison stationed here is strong, confident, and well provisioned. When the news arrives that a Mongol army is approaching, you might feel a flicker of concern. But surely you tell yourself these barbarians from the north cannot breach the defenses of the great Bukhara. But Genghis Khan did not wage war in the way your generals understood it. He did not simply throw bodies against stone walls in a futile display of strength. Instead, he weaponized the very landscape against you. The historians record that rather than attacking the gates, the Mongols diverted the course of a nearby river, directing the rushing waters to flood the defensive moat that protected the city. Watch as the water rises, not to save you but to dissolve the foundations of your security, causing the earthworks to collapse into a slurry of mud and despair. In a matter of days, the illusion of safety is washed away, and the Turkish garrison, realizing that the situation is hopeless, attempts to break out and flee, leaving the civilian population effectively naked before the approaching storm. When the city finally surrendered, the people braced themselves for the inevitable sack, waiting for the screams and the fire that usually accompanied the fall of a metropolis. But what happened next was something far more sinister, because it was so strangely calm. Genghis Khan rode through the city gates, not as a frenzied berserker, but with the deliberate pace of a man inspecting his new property. He rode his horse directly into the courtyard of the Grand Mosque, the holiest site in the city, where the tiles had known only the soft tread of the faithful and the whisper of prayers. The primary source, Atta Malik Juvaini, a Persian historian who later served the Mongol court, captures the sacrilege of this moment with a chilling attention to detail. He describes how the Khan ordered the massive chests, which held the sacred Qurans, to be brought out and emptied. The holy texts, the word of God written in beautiful calligraphy, were thrown onto the dirt to be trampled underfoot, while the ornate wooden chests were filled with grain and used as feed troughs for the Mongol horses. Musicians were summoned to play Mongol songs while the soldiers drank and feasted in the prayer hall, turning the sanctuary of the divine into a stable for beasts. Then Genghis Khan ordered the city's elite, the wealthy merchants, the religious scholars, and the terrified nobility to gather in the courtyard before him. Imagine standing in that crowd, your heart hammering against your ribs, watching this man who smells of horse sweat and dried blood ascend the pulpit where the imam usually preached. You expect a demand for gold or a declaration of a new tax, but instead he delivers a sermon of his own. Juvaini records the words that have echoed down through history with a spectral resonance. O people, know that you have committed great sins, and that the great ones among you have committed these sins. If you ask me what proof I have for these words, I say it is because I am the punishment of God. If you had not committed great sins, God would not have sent a punishment like me upon you. Pause for a moment and consider the sheer psychological weight of that statement. He was not merely claiming political dominance, he was dismantling their spiritual reality. By framing his conquest as an act of divine intervention, he was stripping his victims of their moral high ground, telling them that their suffering was not an injustice, but a penance that they had brought upon themselves. It was a masterstroke of theological annihilation, designed to break the spirit of resistance before it could even form. Because how does one fight against the will of God himself? The people of Bukhara, paralyzed by this declaration, could only watch as the next phase of the operation began. And this is where the generals of the Khan, those hardened men who had followed him from the steppe, began to see the true face of the Yasa. There was no chaotic looting. There was no random violence that might ruin the value of the prize. Instead, the Mongol officers produced scrolls and writing implements. They set up tables in the shadow of the desecrated mosque and began the process of sorting. This was not war anymore, it was administration. The entire population of 30,000 souls was ordered to present themselves for classification, and as families were herded forward, they realized with a dawning horror that they were being assessed not as human beings, but as livestock in a vast planetary market. Fathers looked at their daughters and wondered if they could hide them. Husbands gripped the hands of their wives, knowing that the bonds of marriage meant nothing to the men holding the quills. The terror was not in the swift death of the sword, but in the agonizing uncertainty of the ledger. They were about to be processed through a machine that had been designed to extract every ounce of utility from their existence, And as the sun set, over the broken walls of Bukhara, the scratching of pens on paper sounded louder and more terrifying than the clash of steel. This was the moment the atmosphere shifted from the heat of battle to the cold chill of industrial exploitation. The generals watched as the sorting began dividing the weeping mass of humanity into 4 distinct categories, a categorization system that would become the blueprint for the destruction of half the world. And as the first group was separated from the rest, the true meaning of Genghis Khan's progressive laws became sickeningly clear. The first category to be extracted from the weeping crowd consisted of the artisans. This was the genius of the Mongol system. It was a meritocracy of utility. The officers with their lists were hunting for specific skill sets. Weavers who could spin gold thread into patterns complex enough to please a Khan metalworkers who knew the secrets of folding steel engineers, who understood the mathematics of hydrostatics and ballistics. Imagine a master goldsmith, a man who had spent 40 years perfecting his craft expecting the sword. Instead, he feels a rough hand on his shoulder pulling him out of the line. He is told that he will live. He is told that he will be transported thousands of miles to the Mongol capital of Karakorum, a city of tents that was slowly turning into stone. He is given rations. He is given a wagon. But there is a price for this survival. As he looks back, he sees his wife and children being herded into a different group. He tries to run to them, but the spear points block his path. He is no longer a husband or a father. He is now a unit of production, a human machine owned by the state. His survival is a golden cage. He will spend the rest of his days creating beautiful objects for the very men who destroyed his world, knowing that every necklace he forges is paid for with the silence of his lost family. The second category contained the women and the children. The historical records here are often sterilized by time, but we must not look away from the reality of what occurred. The Yasa, the law that protected Mongol women, viewed foreign women as transferable assets. The young and the beautiful were distributed like spoils of war, assigned to the households of officers, or sent to the slave markets that followed the army like a shadow. But for the children, the fate was perhaps even more insidious. Many were not killed, but adopted. This sounds merciful until you understand the intent. They were taken into Mongol yurts raised by Mongol mothers, taught to speak the Mongol tongue and to worship the eternal blue sky. It was a form of erasure so total that within a single generation, the memory of who they were was wiped clean. It was cultural genocide disguised as foster care, a method of turning the sons of the conquered into the soldiers of the conqueror. The third category comprised the elderly, the infirm, and those whose hands were too soft for labor and whose minds held no technical secrets. The primary sources do not dwell on them. They simply vanish from the narrative. We can only assume that in the cold caloric calculation of the Mongol war machine, mouths that could not work were mouths that would not be fed. Their end was likely swifter final mercy in a world that had run out of it. But it is the fourth category that truly haunts the nightmares of history. This group consisted of the able-bodied men, the laborers, the farmers, the shopkeepers, those with strength in their backs, but no specialized skills. They were not killed immediately. They were conscripted into what the Persians called the Hashar. The word itself sounds innocuous, implying a levy or a draft. But in practice, it was a tactic of such calculated cruelty that it defies comprehension. These men were formed into units not to fight for the Mongols, but to die for them. Visualize the next siege, the city of Samarkand. The Mongol army arrives, but the first wave of troops marching toward the moat is not made of Mongol warriors. It is a wall of rag-clad men stumbling forward under the lash of whips. The defenders on the walls look down with their bows drawn ready to loose their arrows, and their hands freeze. because the face looking up at them from the mud below is not the face of a stranger. It is the face of a cousin, a neighbor, a brother who was captured in the previous city. This was the Hashar, the living shield. These men were forced to carry the siege ladders to fill the defensive ditches with bundles of wood, and if there was no wood, they were forced to fill the ditches with their own bodies. The sensory horror of this experience is unspeakable. Imagine the sound of arrows thudding into the flesh of the man beside you, knowing that he is your shield, and you are the shield for the Mongol soldier walking safely behind you. The psychological impact on the defenders was catastrophic. To defend their city, they had to slaughter their own people. Every arrow loosed was a fratricide. The morale of the garrisons often broke not because of the physical might of the Mongol army, but because of the sheer spiritual exhaustion of killing their own kin. It was a weaponization of empathy, a way to turn the humanity of the enemy into a weakness to be exploited. And from a military perspective, buried under the layers of moral revulsion, we must acknowledge the terrifying efficiency of it. This tactic preserved Mongol lives. Why risk a trained horse archer whose skills took decades to perfect, when you can expend a captured peasant whose life has already been forfeited by the laws of conquest? It was a brutal equation of value where the cost of victory was paid entirely in the currency of the conquered. This was the industrialized horror of the Genghis Khanid system. It was not the random bloodlust of a barbarian horde. It was a sophisticated bureaucratic process of resource management. The people of Bukhara were not massacred. In a fit of rage, they were processed. They were sorted based on their economic and tactical value. The artisans to build the empire, the women to breed the next generation, the children to be assimilated, the strong men to be used as kinetic barriers, and the rest to be discarded. It takes a specific kind of mind to look at a screaming, pleading human being and see only a component in a larger machine. And as the generals watched this engine of flesh and bone churn through the population of Central Asia, they began to realize that the Yasa had created a monster that was legal, that was organized, and that was unstoppable. They were no longer warriors fighting for glory. They were the shift managers of a slaughterhouse that spanned a continent. The question that naturally arises, and the one that historians have wrestled with for 8 centuries, is simple. If the generals of Genghis Khan, men who possessed their own codes of honor, were truly shocked by the cold mechanics of this system, why did they not stop it? Why did the Mongol army not fracture under the moral weight of what they were doing? The answer is as uncomfortable as it is human. They did not stop because the system made them rich beyond the wildest dreams of their ancestors. You see, the brilliance of the Yasa was not just in its punishments, but in its incentives. Before Genghis Khan, a steppe warrior fought for survival, or for a few head of cattle seized in a raid. Under this new industrialized system of conquest, war became the most profitable business on earth. A single campaign against a city like Bukhara or Samarkand could yield more wealth for a Mongol officer than his entire clan had accumulated in 100 years. The sorting process we witnessed in the dust of the city square was not just creating misery, it was creating capital. The artisans sent back to Mongolia transformed the capital of Karakoram from a collection of felt tents into a cosmopolitan metropolis. Primary sources describe a city that seemed to defy the laws of the steppe, with Chinese tiled roofs glittering in the sun, Persian gardens blooming in the arid soil, and fountains that poured wine and fermented milk crafted by Parisian silversmiths who had been dragged halfway across the world. The generals looked at this explosion of prosperity. They looked at their wives wearing the finest silk from China. They looked at their tables groaning under the weight of delicacies from the Islamic world. And they made a choice. They chose to silence their conscience. They chose to accept the narrative that the Yasa was just. They convinced themselves that the efficiency of the outcome justified the cruelty of the method. It was the ultimate corruption, not by vice, but by success. Furthermore, the system became self-reinforcing through the weaponization of fear. The Mongols developed a propaganda network that was centuries ahead of its time. They deliberately allowed a few survivors to escape from the cities they destroyed. These witnesses, traumatized and terrified, were the carriers of a contagion. They ran to the next city, and the next, spreading the tales of the sorting of the human shields of the divine punishment. And it worked. The reputation of the Mongol machine became so formidable that entire regions surrendered without a single arrow being loosed. City governors looked at the approaching dust cloud and simply opened their gates, preferring the heavy tax of tribute and the orderly handover of slaves to the total annihilation of resistance. In a twisted irony, the industrialized horror actually saved lives in the long run by making war unnecessary. It was peace bought at the price of absolute submission. But the legacy of Genghis Khan's system reaches far beyond the 13th century. And this is where we must be brave enough to look in the mirror. It is tempting to dismiss the Mongols as ancient history, as a unique aberration of barbarism that has no relevance to our civilized world. But that would be a lie. The fundamental logic of the Yasa, the idea that you can build a society based on the rule of law and equality for the in-group, while systematically exploiting the out-group, is the blueprint for almost every empire that followed. When the colonial powers of Europe carved up the world in the 18th and 19th centuries, they were operating on the same operating system as Genghis Khan. The British Empire prided itself on the Magna Carta and the rule of law at home in London, while overseeing the organized extraction of resources and human labor in India and Africa. The French Republic proclaimed liberty, equality, and fraternity, but those rights stopped at the shores of the Mediterranean, just as the protections of the Yasa stopped at the walls of the Mongol yurt. The American founding fathers wrote that all men are created equal, a sentiment that echoes the meritocratic ideals of Genghis Khan. Yet they built their economy on the backs of enslaved people who were legally categorized as property. The parallel is undeniable. In each case, there is a circle drawn around the privileged class where justice prevails. And outside that circle, there is only the cold calculation of utility. Genghis Khan did not invent this duality, but he stripped away the hypocrisy. He did not pretend to be bringing civilization to the savages. He told them clearly, "I am the punishment of God." He was honest about the nature of power in a way that modern empires rarely are. So when we look back at the generals standing in the ruins of Bukhara, we are not just looking at men from a distant past. We are looking at the archetype of the bureaucrat of empire, the man who does his job, who follows the law, who feeds his family, and who chooses not to look too closely at where the wealth comes from. The system of the Yasa did not die with the Khan. It merely changed its name, it put on a suit, and it continued to govern the world. To debate whether Genghis Khan was a hero or a monster is ultimately a futile exercise, because history does not care for our moral judgments. It only cares for what survives. And while the Mongol Empire eventually dissolved into the sands of time, the dark innovation of the Khan, the systematic rationalization of cruelty, has proven to be immortal. Stand once more in your mind's eye in the ruins of Bukhara. The dust has settled. The screams have faded. The scribes have packed away their ledgers. All that remains is the silence of a city that has been processed. It is easy to look at the Mongols with their fur coats and their curved swords and see them as alien creatures, as others whose brutality belongs to a savage past. But look closer. Look at the efficiency. Look at the laws. Look at the way they turned human beings into numbers on a page. Does it not feel terrifyingly familiar? We live in a world that is obsessed with categorization. We draw lines on maps. We create tiers of citizenship. We build algorithms that decide who gets a loan, who gets a visa, and whose life is worth saving. We tell ourselves that these systems are necessary for order, just as the Khan told his generals that the Yasa was necessary for peace. The true horror of this story is not what Genghis Khan did to his slaves. It is what he did to the soul of civilization. He proved that if you offer people enough safety, enough prosperity, and enough order, they will agree to almost anything. They will stand by and watch as the others are sorted, are silenced, are erased, and they will call it justice. We are not so different from those generals standing in the mosque. We all have our own version of the Yasa, a mental list of those we believe deserve our empathy and those we deem as necessary sacrifices for our comfort. The line between the civilized administrator and the barbarian warlord is much thinner than we like to admit. It is not drawn in the sand, it is drawn in the heart. So, as you return to the safety of your modern life, I leave you with this question. If you were standing in that courtyard in 1220, holding the pen with the power to save or condemn, would you have had the courage to break the system? Or would you like so many before you simply have done your job?